Great. So welcome, Fabian. It's great to have you, and thanks for taking the time. Isn't it great? We usually end up meeting at conferences or on panels where then you have this kind of you talking for 3 minutes, others me talking for two. Now we get some real quality time, so I really can't wait and look forward to the conversation.
I was just going to say it's an actual conversation we get the opportunity to have. It's great. So thank you very much for the invitation, Matthias.
It's a pleasure, and it's actually a special one. It's the first interview I do, which is broadcast on Real Vision. So let's make it a fun, informal, and really cool one for the audience.
That's good.
Fabian, you are a professor for DLT and Fintech at the University of Basel. You run the university's Center for Innovative Finance. You hold a PhD in crypto assets and blockchain economics, but you're also a best-selling author with the book Bitcoin, Blockchain, and Crypto Assets by MIT Press. But what you do goes way beyond academia. In fact, that's clear when one sees you at the conferences. You're deep into what's happening in the DeFi space. You are on boards of crypto fund, a regulated crypto fund, on working groups for the World Economic Forum, but also a sought-after expert for when it comes to regulators around the world figuring out how to deal with this new asset class. So a very rounded and interesting perspective on what's happening. But before we go into this, I actually want to ask you just personally, how did it all start for you? How did you get into crypto? What triggered your interest?
Originally I always say I was a monetary economist, and I studied economics, and obviously I also had some exposure to financial markets. I used to work for banks previously, but in my spare time, I'm also a huge gaming fan. So I have a video game collection at home, and I started programming in my spare time as a hobby, really. And so when you have these two different perspectives, so first of all, economics and monetary economics, but also the exposure to the more technical side, then you get confronted with these things relatively early. And in my case, it was a friend of mine who told me about this new thing, Bitcoin. And of course, as an economist, I was extremely skeptical in the beginning until I started looking into the math, until I started looking into the protocol itself. And the more I looked into it, the more excited I got.
And when was that? Kind of just to give listeners a sense.
Approximately 2013, but then it took me a while to really get it. I mean, as I said, as with most people you talk to that got exposed to it relatively early, you are really skeptical, and it takes you a while. At least it took me a while to understand.
Yeah. How has if you could, I mean, maybe frame it in some stages or so, how has this evolved? Was it initially just like interest in tech, and then it got into now actually making it's a big part of your life, your job, I guess also privately interest. So how did that evolve, and what were the trigger points for you?
Yeah. At that time I was still a student at the university, and I took the opportunity and started researching it during my studies. So my master thesis was about Bitcoin mining and the efficiencies in Bitcoin mining. So basically looking at which part contributes towards the security of the protocol and which part is actually just waste. So that was a model I have created as part of my master thesis. And from there, then I started writing the book, did my PhD on the topic. Of course, in my private life, I went to all of these meetups here in Switzerland. There was quite an active community, especially in Zurich at that time. And I got to meet all kinds of different people who are really deep into crypto and have been building these exciting protocols. And that helped me a lot, actually, also later in the research.
Yep. Are there things right now, if you look at the industry, that you don't like, kind of, because you can obviously from your neutral perspective from academia?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, sometimes, do you know the book Animal Farm from George Orwell?
Yes.
I think sometimes crypto feels a little bit like Animal Farm. You have all of these ideas, these utopian ideas of decentralizing financial markets and sticking it to the man and whatever these people say. And at the end of the day, not all of them. I mean, there are some people who legitimately have these ideas and want to contribute towards a more open financial system. But when you look at it closely, most of them are just here to make money. And that is super annoying. And also, when we talk about decentralized finance specifically, there are some exciting new protocols and some neutral infrastructure and things that are legitimately decentralized. But most of the protocols have some centralized components. And the claims of decentralization in some cases are just to get around regulation.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned it a little bit. There's also a lot of ideology sometimes, at least on the surface. But then when you go one level deeper, maybe not so much, and just it can also be greed to what you're referring to. For you personally, do you have certain core beliefs that you just really believe in, that you feel a more decentralized financial market infrastructure, or more broadly just world, or at least aspects of the world, the way we transfer anything of value, so that you really believe in and that you're trying to further build on?
One thing I'm extremely worried about, and is when you look at how the world is developing, and that there are more and more data points and just pretty much anything about you and about your personal life and your assets are available in a digital form. And then at the same time, there are certain projects that are trying to put this information on a heavily centralized ledger, which is essentially controlled by one centralized node in many cases. Then this is super dangerous as far as I'm concerned. I mean, when you look at human history, it's cyclical to some extent. And at some point, there will be someone rising to power who will misbehave and will make use of this infrastructure to get rid of political opponents, for example, to get rid of freedom of speech, to just claim the assets from somebody who is not in favor of. And I think that's extremely dangerous. And when you look at the blockchain, what it actually does and the benefits it has is that this very foundational layer, the very bottom, can be decentralized. It belongs to everyone. It can be neutral. It's not controlled by a certain party. And of course, on top of that, you can build centralized services again. There will be certain tokens which are heavily centralized, have some dependencies. There will be additional protocols on top of that. But when you have a foundational layer that is somewhat independent, that is neutral, that's already a huge benefit and might contribute to a better future. And that's what in a nutshell, that is what motivates me.
And your sentiment, if you over the last 5 years, and your confidence in this actually happening, I'm really also talking about that very core protocol, the base layer, and it being decentralized and the benefits it brings. Are you more optimistic, same level of optimism or less than if you kind of the trajectory of the last 5 years? And as you look ahead?
Yeah, a lot more actually, because initially, let's say like 5 years ago, when you talk to commercial banks about these topics, the way in many cases they understood the blockchain is that they want to have a blockchain running in-house, where they are in control of. So essentially a centralized blockchain. And at that point, it's just a centralized database. And many of the advantages that are usually associated with a blockchain, you don't really get when you're the only node running it, right? And in the last few years, I think many companies and many players in the industry started to understand that it's about transparency, about interoperability, about this composability, and started to look more heavily into public blockchains. And that's why I'm quite optimistic that this may actually happen in some parts of the world. In other parts of the world, clearly this will not happen. There we will see a heavily centralized infrastructure with just a single ledger.
Yeah, you're certainly referring to places such as China. I sometimes tell people when they bring forward, oh, China banned Bitcoin, you can also see this as being kind of confirming the what Bitcoin wants to stand for, because it's a significant clash, right? So in that sense, it's not a bad thing for Bitcoin so much. It's just confirming the camps. But do you also see a situation where just the people, like the individuals, even in such structures or countries could still use the decentralized infrastructure and kind of free themselves from complete centralization, or is that a utopian thinking?
I think to some extent it might be possible. The huge problem public blockchains have, it's actually quite the opposite you usually read in the media, is that they may be too transparent. So whenever you're doing something on a public blockchain, there is absolutely no privacy. Yes, you're using pseudonyms. Yes, you're using addresses, accounts. But at the end of the day, when you make one mistake, when you do not hide your IP address, let's say, or there are all certain characteristics that can be associated with your real world identity, then all of the proof is stored on this public ledger. And I mean, yes, as I said, there might be some use cases, but at the end of the day, it's super hard to hide things on the blockchain. And that way, when it's illegal in a certain country, and when there really is a crackdown by a certain government, then it might be hard to do something with these assets. That's why I'm not that optimistic on that front.
Yeah. I would agree. And it's also interesting to then sometimes, if your argument is true, it's also interesting how often and how strongly the argument is brought forward that crypto could be used to, circumvent sanctions or to do illegal activities, which as with any other technology, this of course also happens, but it's actually not as trivial or simple as oftentimes people that haven't really looked into the tech would expect. I think there's a lot of education that we still have to do. Would you agree?
Absolutely. I mean, when you think about sanctions, let's go with that example really quick. And there is a person who is on the sanction list and would like to use Bitcoin, then there are really two options. Number one, this person would have to buy the Bitcoin right now. Then this person would have to go through a regulated entity, such as a centralized exchange or a bank. And they have to apply the sanctions list, right? They are required to do so by the regulator. These are centralized entities. As such, if they actually do their job, then this should not happen. And the other option would be that this person already had Bitcoin for a really long time, but then they still need a Western counterpart, somebody who is not on the sanction list and would be willing to enter a trade, right, for these Bitcoin in that case. Now, we have to understand that this Western counterpart would assume a huge risk from a regulatory perspective, but also reputation-wise. And this goes back again because we're talking about an open ledger, about an open database, and the proof is stored on that blockchain for forever. And the second thing, I mean, what do you do with these Bitcoin? If you're a Western party and you're accepting it, right? And your goal would obviously be to make use of that again. Then you would have to bring it back to your financial system. But when you cannot bring any proof where it actually came from and how you earned these Bitcoin, and it basically cannot show the history, then no one will accept it. And that's why it's not easy at all to circumvent sanctions with these crypto assets.
Hey, if you like this clip, be sure to check out the full interview and more only on realvision.com/crypto. It's 100% free. Sign up now.